morning of January 16th, 1945, the snow in the Ardennes was stained dark with oil, blood, and burned steel. Yet something far more unsettling was happening behind the smoke. Thousands of German soldiers were moving east, slipping away through broken roads and frozen forests. They were battered, hungry, and exhausted, but alive. Many Allied soldiers watching them retreat could not understand what they were seeing. After weeks of brutal fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, after so much death and sacrifice, the enemy was escaping. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. And at the center of that decision stood one man, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The question that would haunt soldiers and historians alike was simple but uncomfortable. Why did Eisenhower let German forces escape after the Battle of the Bulge? To understand that decision, you have to return to the winter of 1944, when the war in Europe was supposed to be nearly over. By December, Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed deep into Belgium. Many soldiers believed they would be home by Christmas. The German army was thought to be on the edge of collapse. Fuel was scarce. Trained replacements were nearly gone. The Luftwaffe barely existed as a fighting force. Confidence was high, maybe too high. Allied supply lines were stretched thin, but morale was strong. Then, before dawn on December the 16th, 1944, the world changed. At exactly 5:30 a.m., under heavy fog and snow, more than 200,000 German troops slammed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes Forest. It was Hitler's last gamble in the West. The plan was bold and desperate. Break through the U.S. Army, will cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied forces in two. If it worked, the Western Allies might be forced to negotiate. For German soldiers, it was a final chance to change the war's direction. For American troops caught in the opening blow, it was pure shock. The fighting that followed was some of the most savage of the entire war. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow fell constantly. Foxholes filled with ice. Weapons jammed. Wounded men froze before medics could reach them. Towns like Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Houffalize became names burned into memory. Units were surrounded, cut off, and forced to fight with whatever they had left. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held out against repeated attacks with almost no supplies. The German advance created a massive bulge in the Allied lines, giving the battle its name. For Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, this was the greatest crisis he had faced. His job was not only to win battles, but to hold together a massive coalition of American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces. Every decision carried political weight as well as military risk. In those early days of the German offensive, Eisenhower moved fast. He shifted reserves, redirected entire armies, and gave General George S. Patton a near impossible order. Turn his Third Army north in the dead of winter and relieve Bastogne. Patton did it in record time. By late December, the German attack was losing momentum. Fuel shortages slowed their tanks. Allied air power returned as the weather cleared. German losses mounted quickly. By January 1945, the situation had flipped. The Germans were no longer advancing, they were trying to survive. Allied forces began pushing back from north and south, squeezing the bulge from both sides. Many officers believed a massive encirclement was possible. If the Allied armies could close the gap near Houffalize, tens of thousands of German troops might be trapped and destroyed. It looked like a chance for a knockout blow. This is where the controversy begins. On maps spread across command tents, the opportunity seemed clear. The 1st U.S. Army and 3rd U.S. Army were driving toward each other. British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery were pushing from the north. If everything moved fast enough, the Germans could be cut off. Some commanders urged speed, They wanted aggressive thrusts, risky advances, anything to close the trap before the enemy escaped. Many soldiers on the ground felt the same. After what they had endured, letting the enemy slip away felt like a betrayal. But Eisenhower saw the situation differently. By early January, Allied units were exhausted. Many divisions had been fighting non-stop for weeks in terrible conditions. Vehicles were worn down. Roads were clogged with traffic and wreckage. Supply lines were still stretched. Fuel and ammunition had to be carefully rationed. Eisenhower knew that pushing too fast carried serious risks. A failed encirclement could turn into chaos. Overextended units might be cut off themselves. A sudden German counterattack, even a small one, could cause heavy losses. Weather was another factor. Although skies had cleared enough for air support, winter storms still limited movement. Roads in the Ardennes were narrow and icy. A single destroyed bridge could delay an entire division. Eisenhower had seen what overconfidence could do earlier in the war. He was determined not to repeat mistakes that could cost thousands of lives. There was also the reality of German resistance. Even in retreat, German units fought hard. They used rearguard actions, roadblocks and demolition charges to slow the Allied advance. They blew bridges, mined crossroads and turned villages into strong points. Trapping them would require speed, coordination and luck. Eisenhower doubted all three could be guaranteed at the same time. Another critical element was Eisenhower's broader strategy. By January 1945, the war's end was no longer in doubt. The question was how to finish it. Eisenhower believed the fastest way to defeat Germany was not through one dramatic encirclement, but through steady pressure across the entire front. He wanted to maintain momentum, not gamble it. His focus was already shifting eastward, toward the Rhine River. Crossing the Rhine would open the heart of Germany. That, in his view, mattered more than destroying every German unit in the Ardennes. Political pressure also shaped his thinking. The Allied coalition was fragile. Eisenhower had to balance American and British priorities. Montgomery favoured a more cautious approach in the north, rebuilding strength before major moves. Patton, as always, pushed for aggressive action. Eisenhower's role was to keep them aligned. Forcing a risky encirclement that failed could inflame tensions and damage trust among commanders. A clean, coordinated advance was safer for both military and political reasons. Meanwhile, the Germans were already pulling back. Hitler had refused retreat for too long, but reality finally forced his hand. By mid-January, German commanders ordered withdrawals to avoid total destruction. They abandoned heavy equipment and wounded soldiers to save what they could. For many German units, escape meant survival, not victory. They crossed rivers under fire, marched through snow without food, and left behind the illusion that the offensive had ever been winnable. Allied forces continued to push, but not at reckless speed. By January 25, 1945, the Bulge was officially erased. The front line returned almost to where it had been before the German attack. The Battle of the Bulge was over. It was the bloodiest battle the US Army had ever fought in Europe, with over 80,000 American casualties. German losses were even higher, and far more damaging. They had lost men, tanks, aircraft, and most importantly, any remaining strategic reserve. Yet the image lingered, German columns slipping away, a chance perhaps to end the war sooner. Critics would later argue that Eisenhower missed an opportunity, that a tighter encirclement could have destroyed the German army in the West, that letting them escape prolonged the war and cost lives later on. Supporters countered that Eisenhower made the only responsible choice, that he preserved Allied strength for the final push into Germany. That caution, in this case, saved lives. The truth lies in the tension between those views. Eisenhower was not trying to be dramatic. He was trying to be decisive in a different way. He understood that wars are not won by single moments alone, but by managing risk, resources, and human lives over time. The Battle of the Bulge had already proven how dangerous desperation could be. Eisenhower refused to answer it with desperation of his own. Still, the question remains powerful because it touches something deeply human. When soldiers fight and suffer, they want meaning in every outcome. Letting the enemy escape feels wrong on a personal level. Eisenhower carried that burden, even if he rarely spoke about it publicly. His responsibility was not to satisfy anger or revenge, but to end the war as surely and steadily as possible. And as January turned to February 1945, his focus shifted fully east. The Ardennes faded into memory, but the decisions made there shaped everything that followed. The Germans who escaped would fight again, but they would never regain their strength. What awaited them beyond the Rhine would be far worse. When the surviving German columns crossed back over the Ourthe and Sauer rivers in late January 1945, they were no longer an army capable of shaping the war. They were shadows of divisions. Many units existed only on paper. Companies were reduced to platoons, platoons to handfuls of men. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel. Artillery pieces were destroyed by their own crews so they would not be captured. What escaped the Ardennes was not a renewed threat, but a wounded force bleeding its last strength. This reality is often missed when people ask why Eisenhower let German forces escape. Escape did not mean recovery. It meant delay before collapse. By February 1945, intelligence reports told a grim story for Germany. The Western Front German army had lost its final operational reserve during the Ardennes Offensive. That loss mattered more than territory. Trained officers were gone. Veteran non-commissioned officers were gone. Replacement troops were young boys, older men, or hastily trained recruits. Many of the soldiers who escaped the Bulge would soon be thrown into defensive positions along the Rhine with little ammunition and no air support. Eisenhower understood this before the battle even ended. Destroying the enemy's ability to fight mattered more than destroying every enemy soldier. This is where hindsight often distorts judgment. Looking back, it is easy to draw arrows on a map and imagine a perfect encirclement. But commanders in January 1945 did not have hindsight. They had weather reports, casualty lists, fuel shortages, beat and exhausted men. Eisenhower's responsibility was not to create a dramatic ending, but to avoid a costly mistake that could slow the entire campaign. He had already seen how quickly optimism could turn into crisis. He refused to gamble the final phase of the war on a single, fragile opportunity. Another key reason Eisenhower did not force a risky encirclement was time. Contrary to popular belief, the war's end was not delayed by the German escape from the Ardennes. In fact, the collapse of German resistance accelerated in the weeks that followed. Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, barely 2 months after the Bulge ended. Once that river barrier was breached, German defences unravelled with shocking speed. Cities fell in days, armies surrendered by the tens of thousands. The remaining German forces simply could not stop the Allied advance. It is also important to understand Eisenhower's mindset as a coalition commander. He was not leading a single national army. He was managing a complex alliance with different doctrines, egos, and political pressures. British commanders favoured methodical advances. American commanders often preferred speed and aggression. Eisenhower's skill was not tactical brilliance on the battlefield, but strategic balance. His strength was keeping the alliance unified while moving forward. A failed encirclement after the Bulge could have fractured that unity at a critical moment. There is also the human cost to consider. Eisenhower had access to casualty projections. He knew what a forced encirclement would likely cost in lives. German units fighting for survival were at their most dangerous. Trapping them would mean bitter, close-range fighting in forests and towns, exactly the kind of combat that had already produced massive casualties. Eisenhower believed those losses were unnecessary when victory was already assured. Preserving Allied lives was not weakness, it was responsibility. Many German soldiers who escaped the Bulge were captured weeks later anyway. Others surrendered when they realized the war was lost. Some died defending cities that no longer mattered strategically. Their escape did not change the outcome. It only changed where and when the final collapse occurred. Eisenhower's strategy allowed the Allies to maintain pressure everywhere, preventing Germany from stabilizing any defensive line. Or critics sometimes argued that Eisenhower should have acted like Patton, pushing harder and faster regardless of risk. But Eisenhower and Patton played different roles. Patton was a battlefield commander, aggressive and daring. Eisenhower was the architect of the entire campaign. He had to think not in days, but in months. He had to consider logistics, politics, morale, and post-war stability. Ending the war cleanly mattered as much as ending it quickly. There was also a larger geopolitical shadow looming over every decision. While the Western Allies fought in the Ardennes, the Soviet army was advancing rapidly from the east. In January 1945, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive that pushed deep into Poland and toward Germany itself. Eisenhower knew that the longer the war dragged on, the more of Europe would fall under Soviet control. A steady, reliable advance toward the heart of Germany was the best way to shorten the war overall and limit further destruction. Risking delays for a dramatic encirclement did not serve that goal. Eisenhower rarely spoke emotionally about the Bulge afterward, but his private writing suggests the weight of those decisions stayed with him. He understood the anger of soldiers who had suffered and wanted the enemy destroyed completely. He understood the frustration of commanders who believed they had been close to a decisive trap. But he also believed that leadership meant resisting emotional decisions, even when they felt justified. By April 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over. German resistance collapsed on all fronts. Hitler was dead. Berlin was surrounded. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The timeline matters. From the end of the Battle of the Bulge to surrender was just over 3 months. That short period supports Eisenhower's belief that caution in January did not prolong the war. If anything, it prevented chaos and allowed the final advance to unfold with overwhelming force. The idea that Eisenhower let the Germans escape also deserves careful wording. Allied forces were attacking, advancing, and killing German troops every day. What Eisenhower did not do was order reckless movements that could have cost tens of thousands of Allied lives for uncertain gain. He chose certainty over spectacle. In war, that choice is often invisible, but it is usually decisive. The Battle of the Bulge became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and recovery. It showed how quickly fortunes could change and how fragile victory could be. Eisenhower's response to its aftermath showed something else: restraint. That restraint was not popular with everyone, but it was consistent with his entire approach to the war. He believed victory came from pressure, coordination, and patience. In the years after the war, historians would debate this decision endlessly. Some would argue the Germans should have been crushed completely in the Ardennes. Others would defend Eisenhower's judgment. What cannot be debated is the outcome. The German army in the West never recovered. The road to the Rhine opened. The heart of Germany was exposed. The war ended soon after. Eisenhower's legacy is often judged by the battles he fought, but it is just as much defined by the battles he chose not to force. The decision after the Battle of the Bulge was one of those moments. It was quiet, complex, and deeply human. It reminds us that leadership in war is not only about bold moves, but about knowing when not to make them. And perhaps that is the real answer to why Eisenhower let German forces escape. Because by January 1945, he was no longer fighting for revenge or glory. He was fighting to end the war with the fewest possible graves left behind. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.